We need a new system. We need a new society. We need to demand that which may have sounded impossible even a few weeks ago, but is not only realizable, but an imperative necessity. The government of Syria has fallen. What does this mean for the people of Syria? What does it mean for the people in Palestine? What does it mean for the people throughout the Middle East and for the new era of global politics? Welcome to the Socialist Program. I'm your host, Brian Becker. Today we're talking once again with journalist and author Vijay Prashad. Vijay is the executive director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, chief editor of LeftWord books. He is a prolific author, most recently publishing a book with Noam Chomsky called On Cuba, Reflections on 70 Years of Revolution and Struggle. Vijay, welcome back.
Thanks a lot, Brian. Great to be with you.
You know, we have often cited, Vijay, that famous quote that sometimes things don't happen for long stretches of a historical period, for decades, and then within a few weeks, decades happen. I think it was Lenin who said that, often quoted. Things happen very, very quickly in Syria in the last few weeks, but if we start the story in the last few weeks, we don't understand what's actually happening. It would be like coming into the movie in the last 10 minutes. Let's go back to the last quarter century, because in order to understand Syria, you have to start not even in 2020 or 2015 or 2011 with the Arab Spring. You can start at the beginning of the 2000s. Anyway, let's get started.
Yeah, you know, it's true that in December, when in 12 days, Hayat Tahrir al-Shams just zipped down the M5 highway, leaving Idlib, going through Hama, Homs, taking Aleppo along the way, and then driving into Damascus. No resistance almost from the Syrian Arab army. It was quite extraordinary. And then, you know, Abu Muhammad al-Julani spoke at the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus. He greeted the people. Mr. Assad, Bashar al-Assad, had, it turned out, flown first to Latakia and then eventually to Moscow. And this has, of course, bewildered lots of people. They've said, well, it's a revolution and so on. I think, you know, there are always many, many stories to tell. Syria is an important old country with its own history. You can't say that everything about Syria is, you know, by foreign intervention. It has its own dynamic. And I think it's therefore well worth looking at some of those dynamics, but also looking at the actually pressing, and I mean pressing, foreign interventions upon Syria. In 2000, Bashar al-Assad, a very young ophthalmologist, very, very reluctant to come into politics, was dragged back by his father, Hafiz al-Assad. Hafiz al-Assad died. Bashar al-Assad was made the president. Initially, Hafiz al-Assad had groomed his elder son to be the president, but he died. You know, this is a failure of Republican regimes. Let's be quite honest, to have a dynasty. You know, there were other people that might have been well equipped to take the role, but they were keen on having the son of Hafiz al-Assad. When Bashar al-Assad came to power, sections of particularly the Damascus petty bourgeoisie, you know, got together, had public meetings, people who were leftists, Baathists, Republicans, communists, and others. This was known as the Damascus Spring. They went in and approached the new president, young president, and said to him, look, can we have a more public dialogue about the future of Syria and what needs to happen in the country and so on. Initially, Mr. Assad welcomed this conclave of a kind of left Republican petty bourgeoisie, but then eventually he shut it down and was not interested in it. This is a bit unfortunate because he might have been able to expand the base of operations of his government, and it shows you what happens subsequently. When the United States decided to go to war, I think a revengeful war against Afghanistan and then Iraq in 2001 and 2003, perhaps the CIA had gone to sleep for a few years, Brian, because what the US government did was deliver this major strategic victory to the Iranians. Within the matter of about 20 odd months, the United States knocked out Iran's principal adversaries on its two borders, the Taliban on the eastern border and Saddam Hussein on the western border. Saddam's knocking over was an enormous advantage for Iran. Iran began to develop links with the new political forces in Iraq and then opened up a land route from Iran through Iraq, through Syria into Lebanon so it could resupply a very close ally, which was Hezbollah. This was an enormous strategic victory for Iran, which finally had access to the Mediterranean Sea. Never had this before since 1979, the Iranian Revolution, hemmed in by Iraq, the war that Iraq was actually paid by the West to conduct from 1980 to 1988. So, having opened the space up for Iran, alarm bells began to ring in Washington, D.C., particularly at the CIA and the State Department. And the US government in 2003 tried to constrain Iran's forward position through Syria by passing an act called the Syria Accountability Act, the Syria Accountability Act, and the Lebanon Restoration of Democracy Act. Some such formulation was there. Basically saying we're going to start sanctioning these countries in order to push Iran back to its borders. Now, the Syria Accountability Act didn't work. Syria comes under sanctions not in 2012, but initially in 2003 as a consequence, not of something Syria had done, but of a strategic calculation by the United States to go and conduct an illegal war against Iraq. Well, if because the sanctions didn't work and the Syria Accountability Act and the restoration of whatever government in Lebanon didn't work, United States green lighted Israel to start a war against Lebanon in 2006, again to try to break what they considered the Iranian influence. And Lebanon and Beirut were quite brutally bombed in 2006. It was a ferocious attack by Israel. But Israel didn't succeed because at the time Hezbollah was very well entrenched. Hassan Nasrallah was not taken out as the Israelis had tried, and Hezbollah was able to continue to fight back. This is so-called the second of Hezbollah's defeats of Israel. The first was in 2000 when they forced Israel to withdraw from southern Lebanon after a very long period of occupation. Well, neither the 2006 bombing of Lebanon nor the Syria Accountability Act succeeded. And so the United States had to sort of bide its time. Well, I mean, I know this is a long story, but it gets interesting and to the point quickly. In 2010, protest starts in Tunisia. Then it is contagious. It moves to Egypt. People go to Tahrir Square. This contagion was seen across the Arab world. In Tahrir Square in Baghdad, there were large protests. You will remember, Brian, we just celebrated the birthday of Muntazal al-Zaidi, who threw the shoes at George W. Bush. He was one of the leaders of the uprising in 2011 inside Iraq's Tahrir Square, where there were big demonstrations. This contagion comes to Syria, as you would expect. And in southern Syria, in Daraa, there were some protests, particularly young people graffitiing things on the walls. The governor of Daraa was very harsh in his crackdown on these young people, so harsh indeed that Mr. Assad had to fire him and apologize to the people. But by then, this tendency of the protests just continued, and it's very striking. The United States ambassador to Syria at the time went to public demonstrations and effectively called for the regime to be overthrown. I mean, just imagine, Brian, if in Occupy Wall Street at around the same time, imagine if the Cuban ambassador had gone to Zuccotti Park and stood up on some pylon there and said, overthrow the government in Washington, D.C. I mean, Washington would have bombed Havana for that. There would have been no question. But the US ambassador was there calling for regime change. And something interesting happens at this time. The protest movement which was not exactly always peaceful, was suddenly an opportunity for scores of Syrians who had gone across the border to Iraq in 2004, 2005 to join the uprising against the Americans. Many of the Syrians who had gone to Iraq in 4, 5, 6, and so on gathered around a Jordanian man who was very famous at the time, Abu Musab al Zarqawi. Al Zarqawi was the guy who sort of brings Al Qaeda and Al Qaeda ideology into Iraqi politics, gathers around him Jordanians, Syrians, and others, trains a lot of people. One of the young people that goes to Iraq at the time, he's a very young Syrian who takes the name Al Julani, which is, in a sense, his nom de guerre after the Golan Heights, is named after the Golan Heights. Mr. Al Julani, who goes across, is then sent by the Iraqis to assist the protest movement in 2011. And he comes to Syria from Iraq and creates a group called Jabhat al Nusra, which means the support front. It's a very straightforward thing. They are to support the protest movement. But of course, this is a euphemism. The idea was to bring their political forces and to galvanize their political forces into the struggle. They go to the north of Syria, where there's an enormous constituency waiting for them. Why? There was a drought in northern Syria in the years between the Damascus Spring and the uprising in Tunisia, a very long period of drought. The Syrian administration wasn't able to fully deal with the drought. Lots of people moved from rural northern Syria into Aleppo, into Idlib, the cities in the north. At the same time, many Saudi trained Syrian clerics returned from Saudi Arabia. They opened service centers and mosques in working class areas of Aleppo and Idlib and basically built the constituency for people like Mr. Al Julani when they returned to the north of Syria. And they created a mass army, effectively, that was armed then by the Turks. Now, you'd ask, why would the Turks arm Al Qaeda factions? Because, after all, the Turkish government of Recep Tayyip Erdogan is a government in the Muslim Brotherhood tradition. And the AKP of Mr. Erdogan was, at the time in 2011, the host of the Muslim Brotherhood so called government in exile, which was sitting in Istanbul. So, why were they giving assistance to these Al Qaeda people? Well, look, the Muslim Brotherhood are the other side of the petty bourgeoisie. The Damascus Spring petty bourgeoisie were people who were effectively, Republicans, secular, leftists, socialists, liberals, and so on. The petty bourgeoisie that was pious, was Islamist one way or the other, they were part of the Muslim Brotherhood. And many of the leadership were anyway in exile out of the country. There was a big massacre of the Muslim Brotherhood in the town of Hama in 1982, conducted by the father of Bashar al-Assad, Hafiz al-Assad. So many of the Brotherhood were anyway living in Turkey and other places. They established themselves as a government in exile, but come on, these guys were not going to pick up a gun and go and fight. They needed an army, and the army for them was provided largely by Turkish ultra-nationalists. Secondly, Syrians who were part of this Al Qaeda-esque, formulation, and then foreigners who came in large numbers, particularly from the Turkic-speaking regions of Central Asia, all the way into Western China, particularly the Uyghurs. They start entering into this conflict, and they dynamize, in a way, the conflict against Mr. Assad in 2012, 2013, 14. They seize a number of cities. The Syrian Arab army, finding itself in a difficult position, asked for assistance from Hezbollah across the border in Lebanon. And Hezbollah had its own reasons to enter the conflict, because they were worried that these Al Qaeda forces would cross the border and basically wipe out the Shia population there, because these were deeply sectarian political forces. They asked for assistance from Iran, which anyway was willing to come in and assist Hezbollah. And they asked for assistance from the Russians. The Russians militarily intervened in 2015. But while they pushed this rebel army into the north, particularly into the city of Idlib, they were not able to actually defeat them. And the reason they couldn't defeat them is twice the Syrian army, backed by the Iranians and the Russians, tried to move on Idlib, and twice the Turks invaded Syria and cut a deal with Damascus and the Russians, saying this is a protected zone. So this zone, Idlib, was incubated for Hayat Tahrir al-Shams, waiting for the day in December when they would start, or rather late November of 2024, when they started on their march to Damascus. They were waiting for the opportunity, and the opportunity was provided in many ways by the Turks and the Israelis.
Well, let's just sort of focus more in on this recent period then, Vijay, and thank you for that history. At a certain point, because of the Russian intervention in 2015, the Russian government said, look, we're not going to let the Syrian state be dismembered, fall apart. And they said, whether you like or don't like Assad, the Assad government is the government. It's the recognized government by the UN. And they insisted that the sovereign government be allowed to remain. And so the Russians came in, the Russian Air Force came in. You also had Hezbollah, you had Iranian-backed militias and military forces. The rebels, the HTS, the people who have now become the government, or at least the interim government in Syria, they were defeated. There was an agreement made, and I want you to help the audience understand, because it sounds pretty complex from a distance, and it is complex, but we can also break it down. We can also make people understand it. There was an agreement made when the rebels were defeated that all over Syria they would be given essentially safe transit to Idlib, which is in the northwest part of Syria, bordering Turkey. And Turkey basically, in the past, during the Ottoman Empire, Syria was part of the Ottoman Empire. It was under essentially Turkish control. So Erdogan, who has this neo-Ottoman sort of perspective of reestablishing Turkish hegemony in what was the former Ottoman Empire, he basically takes control of that province. In other words, he's the guarantor. The Turkish military is the guarantor for this now large assembly of right-wing Islamic forces who have gathered together following their defeat in Syria and the other parts of Syria. They're given safe transit, and there's an understanding that they won't be attacked by the Syrian government. They're going to stay put. And then in 2020, the Syrian government starts to move against them, starts to reclaim or wants to reclaim sovereignty. What happens?
Yeah, this is a very interesting story. I think, and I think it's important to first say quite directly, Brian, that Syria had been Balkanized long before this December. To now say Syria might be Balkanized is afactual. Syria was Balkanized in 2012. That's when it begins. And so let's deal with the map of Balkanization in a way to understand what you just asked. Firstly, the north, and particularly the northwest of the country, was essentially seized by Turkey or Turkish proxies. You see, across the border in Raqqa Governorate in Syria, there is an old tomb of Suleiman Shah. Suleiman Shah is the founder of the Ottoman Empire in the 13th century. And it has been a long-standing grievance of modern-day Turkey that the tomb of Suleiman Shah is outside Turkish borders. When the Sykes-Picot Agreement was done, when the French decided to claim this mandate territory of Syria, they put the Suleiman Shah tomb inside the mandate territory of the French, not in the new Turkey, modern Turkey. It has been a 100-year grievance of the Turkish state. And in fact, in the early part of this war, Turkish troops crossed the border and they occupied the tomb of Suleiman Shah. So Turkey had effectively occupied parts of Raqqa Governorate and Idlib in the northwest since 2012. Secondly, in the northeast of the country, where the Kurdish population of Syria and other minority groups, it has to be said, the northeast region is extremely diverse part of Turkey, but there's a large Kurdish population. The Kurdish group there had played host for years to the Kurdish Workers' Party, the PKK, that operate in southeastern Turkey. For years, when the PKK was under attack inside Turkey, they used to cross the border. Mr. Assad allowed them to operate bases there. Sometimes they crossed the hilly terrain into Iraq. That area is very difficult terrain, very high mountains. I've been into that area. It's not the easiest place for the Turkish government to get at the PKK bases across the border in Iraq. But after the 1991 U.S. occupation the U.S. creation of the Northern Kurdish Autonomous Region.
I want to bring a map up of Syria because as you're
Yeah.
talking about this, I think it's really important for the audience to see where is the northwest part of Syria, the northeast part of Syria where the Kurds are, where American troops end up. So let's bring up this map and then you can continue. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. So for instance, if you look at the map now, you look at towns like Manjab and so on, that area of Al Raqqa, northern Al Raqqa, and so on. That region is where the Kurds had developed through their contact with the PKK over the years a lot of military experience. And out of that experience is formed the YPG, the protection group. Effectively, they were set up to protect the Kurdish population from some of these Al Qaeda elements and later from ISIS when ISIS appears in that area. And so, if the Turks had control of the northwest of Syria, the area of Idlib, just north of Aleppo, and parts of Raqqa Governorate, the Kurds had a swath of Syria from Manjab on this side out around the north of Al Raqqa toward the Iraqi border. So the Kurds were there. I'm trying to paint a picture of balkanization happening in 2012. Let's go further south now. In the southern part, you can see the city of Dara, for instance. Here, there were protest movements that had started, as I said, in 2011, young kids going out and protesting. Well, these cities continued to be, difficult for the Syrian government to control. So what the Syrian government does in about 2013, 14, 15 is they start making deals with some of these rebel organizations in the south and say, look, we're going to let you guys have some autonomous control, but we'll call it peace and we'll say that we have sovereignty. So over many cities in the south, the Syrian government didn't exercise full sovereignty. And then the United States enters Iraq. From Iraq, it enters Syria in Deir ez-Zor and in Homs Governorate. It's important to remember, right across the border from Homs Governorate in Jordan, the United States has a massive military base. Once I tried to drive up there, it was impossible. I mean, you can't get there. It's an enormous base. It's highly secure and so on. The US government is all around at the time in 2011, 12, 13, was all around that section of Syria. And the US then enters into Deir ez-Zor and basically occupies the oil fields of eastern of Syria and continues till now to hold them. It's interesting. During the Trump administration, Donald Trump said, well, we're going to withdraw from Iraq. They withdrew the so-called ordinary troops, but they left special forces. There were at least minimum 1,000 special forces and their support troops. So we don't even know how many troops, where they are based, anything like that. It's super secure. But what's very clear is the US government is holding the oil fields. I did a group story with people in Al Arabi Al Jadid, where we tracked how the oil from these fields was being effectively sold to ISIS and then was taken through Turkey all the way. Erdogan's family was involved in the transit of vast amounts of oil. The oil then was shipped to Malta, transshipped at Malta, and then brought back and sold to Israel. A very interesting story. It's still up on the Al Arabi Al Jadid website.
So Syrian oil And Israel was bombing Syria, has been bombing Syria nonstop. But Syrian oil through ISIS, through Turkey, ends up with Israel.
That's exactly what we found. I mean, it's transshipped in Malta. There were a lot of attempts to disguise the paperwork and so on, but it took really good reporting to uncover that story. And the journalists from Al Arabi Al Jadid did a splendid job of showing that. It really bothered the Turkish government, this story, because it also fingered Mr. Erdogan's family as making a profit because they own one of the ports through which the oil went out. We interviewed a guy who runs the truck route through Turkey because they had to transship into Turkish trucks. They couldn't take trucks from these guys from ISIS who were bringing them to the border. Anyway, the United States has held the oil fields in large parts of eastern Syria since at least 2012. This has been a long time. Now, if you look at the map, what's left? What's left of Syria under the control of Damascus? It was Damascus, it was Homs, Hama, it was parts of Aleppo after very big fighting, a lot of the city destroyed, and it was the coastal region of Latakia and Tartus, where the Russians had the base and where there's a large concentration of Alawite population, the minority group from which Bashar al-Assad and his father Hafiz al-Assad comes. By the way, that Russian naval base is very important. And you and I have talked about this before, Brian, because, it wasn't the intervention in 2015 to secure to some extent the base in Latakia. It wasn't just that. The year before, the Russians went in and secured their base in Crimea. The two bases, the Crimea base and the Tartus Latakia bases, these are the two warm water bases that the Russians have. They don't have any others. Of course, climate change is going to open up other bases for them, perhaps in the northern area. But for now, this is it. The loss of Crimea, if Ukraine had gone the other direction, and the loss of Tartus Latakia would have meant Russia had no ability to have boats in the water around the year. They wouldn't have had a navy, unless they made a deal with some third party, which they didn't have, which is itself surprising.
So let me just jump in right there because I want to provide some historical context for this. That Russian military base in Syria, which is a warm water port, and the other warm water port was in Crimea, in the Black Sea. And this was established during the era of the Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So it becomes Russia later after the fall of the Soviet Union. And of course, Russia was the anchoring republic in the USSR. But, Vijay, if you think about the global geostrategic battle that was going on during the so-called Cold War, the United States Navy was everywhere. It was in the Pacific, it was in the Atlantic, it was in the Indian Ocean. The U.S. has warm water ports everywhere and military facilities everywhere. And the Soviet Union had exactly 2 warm water ports. Again, I want people to think about the geostrategic dimension of this. A lot of times if we're watching CNN and forming our opinions about Syria, and we see some crowds celebrating about the fall of Assad. Yeah, well, some people are celebrating the fall of Assad. The other parts of the population are not out in the streets. They're actually hiding right now because they're afraid of these right-wing Islamicists. So we don't see them. And the U.S. media just portrays this one part of the population as if it's the population. But frankly, the United States doesn't actually care about what's going on inside Syria that much. They don't care that much about the form of government in Syria or Saudi Arabia or anywhere. They're thinking about this in geostrategic, from a geostrategic framework. And that's also critically important for people on the left to also understand at least what's going on. It doesn't mean we don't care about what's going on in Syria. It doesn't mean we only want to think in geostrategic terms. We don't. We care about people everywhere. But the geostrategic element here is actually dominant. And again, if you could talk a little bit more about that, because since 2015, The Russians are now involved in the Ukraine war. Their ability, their mobility, their ability to maneuver is reduced. And at the same time, the U.S. has Israel is essentially like an extension of Pentagon power, and it's wreaking havoc in Lebanon and Syria. Anyway, let's everybody think about this in a global perspective. Go ahead.
No, I quite agree with you that it's not that we don't care about the Syrian people, quite the contrary. I mean, I worry about what's going to happen to Syria very much. Didn't mean that I didn't worry previously. I started with the Damascus Spring. Our friends were put in jail then. I was the co-chair of the committee for the release of a communist who was in prison during that period. This is a long story for us. This is not just yesterday's news. But let's come back to that military base. It's a good place to start. In 1967, during the Six-Day War, the U.S. Sixth Fleet, which was operating out of Italy, played a very important role in the Eastern Mediterranean, because again, the U.S. was able to come and just garrote to blockade the whole Eastern Mediterranean, prevent any resupplying to the Palestinians and so on. They're doing that right now again. But the Sixth Fleet in Italy provoked a debate inside the USSR. And it was in 1971, 4 years later, that the Soviet Union made a leasing arrangement with the Syrian government of the time to have what was then not a full-scale base, but an operating facility. To have ships able to anchor there. Effectively, it was a base, but it was in response to the fact that the U.S. Sixth Fleet had provided logistical support and prevented the Palestinians from being resupplied in 67. And so that's the context of that base. It's not for Soviet power projection by itself. Of course, that's part of it, but it wasn't, inspired by that. It is really important to look at how the anchors of the Assad government were weakened in this last couple of years. It is certainly true that the Russian forces have been detained in Ukraine, but not just in Ukraine. They are worrying about the expansion of the war. Germany is building a base in the Baltics. They're going to have maybe short-range nuclear missiles there. A Russian general was killed at his house. They are worried about the expansion of NATO's war onto Russian territory. They warned Mr. Assad repeatedly, and we have this on record, that the situation in Syria was dire. It was unlikely that Russia would be able to send squadrons of fighters to defend the Syrian government. So the Ukraine war certainly did, reduce Russia's ability to intervene on behalf of Mr. Assad. The Iranians, ever since the attacks on Iranian soil by the Israelis, probably helped by the United States government, those attacks and the belligerent talk by the U.S. government about, threatening Iran, saying Iran is next, and so on, meant that Iran didn't want to, expand its presence in Syria at this time. I'm going to come back to the Hezbollah thing because this is related to Iran. But the Iranian foreign minister was in Damascus just when Aleppo was falling. He warned Mr. Assad that this threat of Hayat Tahrir al-Shams is real. Mr. Assad said, no, it's a strategic retreat of our forces from Aleppo. We're going to try to build a perimeter and stop them from advancing. But the Iranians said, we don't have the capacity to provide support at this time. It's important to remember the new president of Iran is not, a guy who's willing to go toe to toe with the United States. He's quite a moderate figure. So from above, you don't have the kind of political unity between the Republican Guard and the president's office. There isn't that unity. Then, thirdly, the Israelis have been pummeling not only, of course, the genocide against the Palestinians, but pummeling Lebanon, for months on end. And then the assassination of Syed Hassan Nasrallah has really demoralized Hezbollah. Let's just be very clear. Hezbollah continues to fight against the Israelis, But this is not the Hezbollah of the 1990s. This is not the Hezbollah even of the 2000s. This is a much reduced Hezbollah. I mean, that's the reason why Israel was willing to sue for a ceasefire and a big zone of no activity by Hezbollah. Hezbollah was not able and prepared to cross the border to defend the government. That means that the three major external anchors of the Syrian government were unavailable: the Russians, the Iranians, and Hezbollah. And then, as if to help the Hayat Tahrir al Sham, now I don't know if this is fully coordinated, Brian, but it certainly feels coordinated. The Israelis begin a pretty systematic attack on Iranian and Syrian military posts bit along the M5 highway. They hit logistical depots, ordnance depots. They hit the intelligence office in Damascus, the headquarters of Syrian intelligence, and so on. They demoralized the military, which had anyway not been properly rebuilt over the last couple of years. It had suffered its own demoralization from a long period of war and pretty ruthless US sanctions at the same time. The conditions of life in Syria were quite poor. So this provides, the context. And my God, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, to claim that this is a Syrian victory is a bit myopic, because they were provided full Turkish military support. They were provided effectively air support by the Israelis. Now, somebody can turn around and say, well, the Syrian government got Russian, Iranian, and Hezbollah external support. Yes, certainly. Nobody's saying the Syrian government was fighting on its own, but nor was Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. This was not an internal Syrian struggle. This was a power game of regional actors. And by overthrowing the Assad government, Israel has won a major victory, because now Israel has a peace agreement with Egypt, which was signed in 1979. Israel has a peace agreement with Jordan, signed in 1994. Israel has a ceasefire deal which prevents Hezbollah from operating, very close to the perimeter fence with between Lebanon and Israel. And now Israel has not only got the promise from Mr. Al-Jolani that he will not allow people to attack Israel from within Syria, but they've gone in and seized the UN buffer zone and more that was established in 1974 more. It's important for people to know that in the period since December, when the Assad government fell, till yesterday, Israel has taken more land in Syria than the square footage of Gaza. It has already occupied that territory with ambitions to go further, occupy more territory. It's making deals with various Druze communities in the south to occupy Druze villages and so on. This is very crafty of them, continuing the balkanization and weakening. I want to underline this point. This was not Syrians versus Syrians. This was not what happened just now. This was a war between powers, regional and global. And one side prevailed over the other in December of 2024, and they put into office a cleaned up Mr. Al-Jolani, former Al-Qaeda, now talking about democracy, most likely fundamentally trained for that exclusive CNN interview by some kind of PR firm based in Washington or Tel Aviv that came to Idlib and trained him how to say that his massacres of minorities in Iraq and in Syria previously were youthful indiscretions.
So important, Vijay, because it's not Syrian versus Syrian. There is an element of that, but that's not decisive here, everybody. That's not what drove the events of the past days and weeks. HTS, Jolani, Al-Qaeda, and also deputy commander of ISIS, they are the new interim government, and they are telling the Palestinian factions that have had political and military bases in Syria for a long time as part of the opposition to the expanding Zionist control over Arab lands, that they must shut down, that they must be disarmed. And when they were asked about the Israeli destruction of Syria's army, Syria's navy, Syria's air force, all of this has been destroyed in the last 2 weeks. they were kind of like ho-hum about it. They were like, yeah, we hope that all sides will respect Syrian sovereignty, meaning not even protesting the destruction of Syria's military capability by Israel. So when you look at this, you can't but come to the conclusion that the Arab movement, the movement for Arab sovereignty, the progressive Arab movement that's existed for many, many decades, not just in Palestine, this is a major setback and a major victory for imperialism and Israel, which is an extension of imperialism, or certainly an extension of imperialist power. That's the reality. And I think it's really important for the left to sort of have a clear understanding and appreciation of this, that this is part of a longer story. The normalization of relations with Israel is really first and foremost an effort to destroy the progressive pan-Arab movement for justice for the oppressed people in the Arab world, hundreds of millions of oppressed Arab people. And by Arab people, I mean all the peoples in the Arab world, not just Arabs, including Kurds and others. One thing that I think will be confusing, and I want you to help the audience become unconfused, is the role of Islam and the role of religion, because the re-intervention of U.S. military forces in Iraq and in Syria was what the American people were told was to stop the war on terror generated by Islamic forces like Al-Qaeda, like ISIS. And here you have the United States and Israel cooperating with, really using and utilizing these same forces to basically destroy or try to destroy the progressive Arab movement. Again, Vijay, this also has a historical root going back to the 1940s. Again, it's not about Islam. Hezbollah is Islamic. HTS is Islamic, but Hezbollah is anti-imperialist. HTS is not. So it's not about Islam per se, but it's about how imperialism manipulates people's language, categories, and religions for its own imperialist interests. Anyway, let's go over some of that history.
Yeah, this is very complicated because we live in a world where Islamophobia is rife. And, people see a T-shirt with Arabic writing and they think you're saying something terroristic. It's got to that stage of ridiculousness. Your T-shirt might have your name on it, or it might even say the Boston Red Sox in Arabic, as a joke. But somebody will say, my God, get this guy off the plane. We live in that kind of context globally, where there is this deep Islamophobia. Now, on the other hand, it is also true that from roughly the 1970s, I've written about this at great length, how the Central Intelligence Agency worked with the government of Saudi Arabia and other, of what Tariq Ali calls the petrol stations of the Gulf, like Kuwait and so on, these countries to build an organization called the World Muslim League, where they effectively was set up to to bring Pakistani Bibles and distribute them in what was known to them as Central Asia or in Dagestan, parts of the Soviet Union where there was a Muslim population. The same thing they did in Western China, where they were coming in and preaching to the Uyghur population of Western China against communism and for a kind of Islam incubated in Saudi Arabia, Wahhabi Islam, very much a sectarian Islam against any kind of so-called apostasy. This becomes more and more popular in parts of the Muslim world, and it increases sectarianism. Sectarianism isn't a normal thing. People can have line differences in religion just as they have line differences in politics. But that doesn't mean you go and slaughter people, because there's a difference in understanding of the tradition and belief and so on. Hezbollah, interestingly, coming out largely of the Shia tradition, has a very tolerant understanding of differences, because Hezbollah also is incubated in Lebanon, which is a very pluralistic society. There are Christians, there are Druze, there are Sunnis, there are Shia, have been Palestinians there since 1948, in fact, before then, and so on. A very pluralistic country. It was impossible for Hezbollah, and its leader, Syed Hassan Nasrallah, understood that it would be impossible for them to have a sectarian politics. They always said, we believe what we believe. You don't have to believe what we believe. We respect your right to do things like drink and so on. We are not going to do it. You can do it, but we don't want you to impose it on us. We won't impose it on you. It's a very interesting form of pluralism. I respect that. I don't necessarily agree with all other people's beliefs, but I don't need to impose things on people as long as they are not imposing it on the body politic. I think that's a formula that Hezbollah has basically followed. Well, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham has tried to differentiate itself from its origin in Al Qaeda, in Jabhat al-Nusra, in a faction that becomes ISIS, in Mr. Zarqawi in Iraq. That faction comes straight out of Saudi hardcore sectarianism, where the framework for them is those who are nearest are the worst. In other words, Islam, people who call themselves Muslims but have created their own path are worse than those who are not Muslims. It's a very peculiar understanding of the world. So for them, for instance, the Shia are a greater threat than a Christian. But Christians are also a threat. And it's interesting, when ISIS started to behead people in the north of Syria and Raqqa governorate, in the early part of ISIS's appearance, the Western press focused on the beheading of Americans and British journalists. I knew at least one of the people who was killed. I knew him personally, a very good reporter. He had got his degree from UMass Amherst, had been kidnapped previously and so on. Anyway, but there were scores of Syrian Arab army soldiers who were being mass executed in the most brutal style by these same groups, not because they were Syrian army. If you watch the videos, you'll listen to these guys call them the biggest slur words, against the Shia. I don't even want to repeat those words. They massacred people based on their religion. That's their tradition. It's not that it's not their form of Islam. It is Wahhabism of a worst kind, the kind that is incubated and goes to Al Qaeda and so on. Now, by criticizing them, one is, I hope, not being Islamophobic, because that kind of argument suggests, that if I critique Israel, I am being anti-Semitic. For God's sake, there's got to be room to criticize people like Al Qaeda. There's got to be room to criticize people like Jabhat al-Nusra. And I would like to say there's got to be room to critique Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which it has now been reported in Idlib was running a state form where they were saying no music allowed, no this allowed, no that allowed. Sounded a lot to me like the Taliban in Afghanistan. And for those who say, well, but the Taliban is following Afghan traditions, furthest from the truth. Afghanistan has the most heterodox tradition of Islam, complicated, wonderful, beautiful forms of Islam. The Taliban imports that ideology from the camps and teachers in Pakistan, most of them trained in Saudi Arabia. In Iraq, in the north, there was beautiful heterodoxy. Anybody who had visited Aleppo or Idlib even will be able to talk about the shrines to different peers and important figures of historical Islamic interest. All of this is considered apostasy by this tradition. So yes, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham comes out of that tradition. Now, when Jolani arrives at Umayyad Mosque in Damascus and says, we don't want to hurt anybody, nobody should go and attack the Zainab, the Sayyida Zainab shrine that's there outside Damascus. Sayyida Zainab shrine is one of the most important shrines for the Shiite community around the world. I was worried that this shrine might be destroyed. That would open up an enormous can of battle around the Middle East. Fortunately, the shrine is still intact. There are occasionally rumors of smaller shrines getting attacked. But Jolani did say, to his credit, that we should not attack other communities. Now, how long this is going to continue, and Is he going to be able to control his forces? Is this a deal that he has made with the Israelis and Americans and so on for the public? Let the public lose interest and then they go after these communities. My friends, for instance, who live in Syria, that is their feeling. Their feeling is there is an interlude while the international media is paying attention. The moment CNN stops doing its fake news from the prisons of Syria, where I don't know if you saw Clarissa Ward's ridiculous piece. The moment the television cameras disappear, these guys are going to go harsh on the minorities. It's very difficult to say. For the sake of Syria, I hope that Mr. Jolani is being sincere and is not going to unleash that ideological seam against the people of Syria. I very much hope that that will be the case. But, Brian, who's to know?
Yeah, well, if you look at the New York Times coverage about HTS and their rule in Idlib, when they're functioning basically under the protection of the Turkish military, cafes can't play music, but the water taps work, meaning, some things are working, but they're banning people from doing things that people have done for ages in these different parts of Syria. So you have the experience of what actually happened in Idlib. They ran Idlib, hookahs and music were banned from the beginning. If people violated it, they would be terribly punished. It was a military dictatorship in Idlib. They set up prisons for anyone who defied them. So I think that, but see what people did rather than listen to the words they use in order to have a compass of what's likely to happen. But at the moment, when the U.S. is pretending that what we just experienced was this mass uprising from inside of Syria against tyranny and despotism and dynastic rule, like as if that's the entire part of the story, they have to tamp this down, because if it's immediately like ISIS beheading people en masse because they're Shiites or because a woman doesn't cover her hair, that's not going to look like liberation in the Western media. So they have to tamp it down. Again, we don't know. We can't be overly predictive. Perhaps there will be this exercise of social control over HTS. But if they have their druthers, they're going to rule as they ruled in Idlib, because we have the experience of it. I want to go back to something else you said, and I know we don't have that much more time, Vijay, but you talked about the struggle inside of Syria, and I 100% agree with you, that it was in many ways a proxy fight between different international actors. So you have the Syrian Arab Army, the government of Syria's army, which is predominantly Sunni, even though Bashar al-Assad's family is Alawite Muslims, in other words, a religious minority. The majority of the army is Sunni, and they stayed with the government during those years. And they lost 125,000 soldiers who died fighting ISIS and al-Qaeda, etc. So you have the Syrian Arab Army. It's there. It's major. It's not simply just a puppet, but they have allies. And the allies were Hezbollah. The allies were Russia. The allies were Iran. And the other forces, including Israel and the U.S. and Saudi Arabia and Turkey, were the allies basically of other forces, at times Kurds, at times recently HTS. Now, if people think about that in one way, they'll think, well, it's just a chessboard. And that's the entire story. This is the kind of the dialectical tension between geostrategic politics and the internal politics of a struggle. I want to remind people in the United States that were it not for the intervention of the French and the Polish military forces during the American Revolution, there was no possibility that George Washington would have succeeded. He lost every battle. He was known for being the practitioner of the retreat. He only won the last battle. It was really foreign forces that allowed the American War of Independence to succeed. Now, whatever one thinks about that war, my point is, in American schools, we're not taught, thank goodness that the French and the Polish came and rescued that hapless George Washington, who had no capacity without foreign forces. We only learn about what the American government wants us to tell our people about, these creation myths about the founding fathers, about the creation of a republic, an independent republic. It's not unusual in history that international forces are engaged in a struggle that has a particular place, a particular people at the center of it, and it doesn't dismiss the significance of that internal struggle. From my point of view, the Assad government, whatever its defects and failings, and there were many, and dynastic rule being one of them, as you pointed out, nonetheless, given its social composition and its relationship, say, to Syrians, to pluralism, towards religious minorities, towards ethnic minorities, towards imperialism, towards Zionism, far more progressive than the new HTS government, because this government, no matter how it turns out, is fundamentally an extension of American and Israeli political power and military power. Anyway, those are sort of the way I approach it, and I hope the audience can kind of wrap their head around what's seemingly complex but has a lot of historical precedent.
Brian, I want to just add that, yes, it's very unclear what's going to happen, but there are forces on the ground that are quite interesting, and we should follow and see where they go. Some of the left forces, the Syrian communists and others, have created a national coordination body for the forces of democratic change. That's a clumsy translation into English of the name, but effectively it's a coordination. They're bringing together some secular, to some extent left liberal forces that want to pursue a democratic agenda. I think this is a good, productive direction for some of these forces. Let's see what happens. They want to contest in the cities. They don't want to run and flee. They actually want to stay and contest. It's a very brave thing for them to do at this time. They want to take Mr. Jolani at his word. He says, well, we're going to make a democracy. You want to make a democracy? Let's have a democracy. Let's open this up. Let's see if the forces of the left will be allowed to organize. Let's see if the old trade unions will be able to revitalize. Let's see what happens if clubs are created and so on. I would want to say that I don't feel like this is a place right now where everybody is gone to ground. I think it's important to note that the left is standing up, has formed this body, wants to contest in whatever small way possible. And I think it's important for us to highlight and uplift their struggle against the HTS imposed government, and also their struggle to ensure that Syria doesn't fundamentally alter its challenge to Israel, because Israel should not be permitted to have safe borders at this time. I mean, Israel should not be permitted to walk into a country and just seize land. I mean, it's very interesting that when Russia enters Ukraine and takes the Donbass region, it's an international incident. Israel comes in and takes the equivalent of Gaza and more inside Syria, and it's perfectly seen as a security matter. I don't get it. I don't understand how European politicians can look at that and say, well, that's absolutely appropriate. This is once again, Brian, what we've talked about, the international division of humanity. When Israel does it, it's perfectly acceptable. Somebody who's an adversary of the West does it, it's totally unacceptable. But I think the coordination body, I hope they will contest Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and others on the issue of normalization with Israel. And I think that will be a really important fight now, given the context of the ongoing genocide.
Last point, and conforming to what you're just saying about the Syrian left, this is a battle that hasn't, the final battle has not been fought. Let's put it that way. There is a big setback, but it's not finished. It's dynamic. And you can see, Vijay, that the Palestinian forces and the Lebanese forces, the resistance forces, are basically adopting the same tone. They say we support the Syrian people's right of self-determination. We want them to go forward and to have progress. We insist that the Zionist Israeli regime not continue to bomb Syria, grab Syrian land. They're trying to putting the best face on a bad situation. They're trying to project the idea that it is an unfinished fight, and that instead of quitting, instead of surrendering, instead of running away, they're saying, we're going to engage here. We're not giving up. We're not going away. And I think, and I'm going to let you have the final word here, this is a mature, sober, not Pollyannish, but mature attitude towards a setback, which is, yes, it's bad, but it's an unfinished battle. And what we all do, and I would say, when I say we, I don't even mean people in Palestine, people in Lebanon, or people in Syria. What we, the American people, because the U.S. government is funding all of this Israeli terror, what we all do as a global movement actually ultimately could be decisive. If we do nothing, it will be decisive in the wrong direction. It doesn't mean victory is guaranteed, but the struggle hasn't finished. Anyway, you get the last word.
You know, it's interesting, when Mr. Assad got on the plane and left, he didn't make a statement before he left. It's interesting, and I think important to focus on that, because when other Republican leaders, whatever their histories again, and it's appalling that one has to keep qualifying this. But Saddam Hussein, right till the end, right till he was hung, yelled at the judge, you are a dog, the son of a dog, and so on. Mr. Gaddafi, when he was being brutally attacked and then killed in Sirte, his hometown, turned to his attackers and said, "Do you know I am Muammar al-Gaddafi, the president of Libya, and you are a dog and the son of a dog." Mr. Assad didn't say that. As I said, he was a reluctant head of government. He arrived in Moscow and then released a statement which effectively said, "I was there till the end and I left." He didn't say, "You are all sons of dogs and the sons of dogs, and I'm coming back to fight you." Which is why I think the tone around the region has been that it's unlikely that there will be an attempt to restore the Assad dynasty. 53 years of Assad, it's over. He wants to be an ophthalmologist in Russia. His career is going to go there. Something else is going to happen inside Syria. And I think that's why the response in Syria has been extremely measured. And I think this maturity comes directly at the heart of what we are contesting. I think it's an error to sit back and have a debate about, was the Assad government good or bad? I think that is really a futile question, because that has been a settled question. That's finished. That era is gone. Now the question is, where will Syria go? We are more interested in the dynamic of the Syrian people, the dialectic of Syrian history. And in that sense, I think we see the contest by the National Coordination Body. We see the words coming from Lebanon, from particularly the Palestinians. They are being gagged inside Syria. They want to unleash the gag. They want to re-enter the conflict. This is an open struggle. We will see forces that have gone off from Syria to Iraq return. How will they return? Will they return with guns? Will they return politically? I don't know yet. Truckloads of Syrian military and other generals and so on went off to Iraq. What will they do? Will they remain in exile? We don't know. I am hoping that they don't come back and there's a long, dangerous, futile insurgency that goes for many years. I hope they will contest this government's word that it wants to create a democracy and see where it goes. Let this government fire the first bullet. Let this government be challenged for what it has already said, and let this government be challenged particularly on the question of normalization with Israel and the Palestinian Emancipation Project.
Vijay Prashad, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.